Good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon is dedicated to questions of business administration, and sustainability. And it's my particular pleasure to introduce to you a very prominent speaker, which will give us the keynote this afternoon, Professor Roland Deiser from the Peter Drucker School of Management of Claremont Graduate University. Professor Deiser has been living in the United States for several decades, meanwhile, I think, yeah. But he's an Austrian. I don't know where you were born, but in Innsbruck, yeah. That was also the town where he studied political science and psychology in the 1970s, and where he got his PhD as one of the first students of Anton Pellinger, as he told me yesterday. And he then pursued a career which is extremely interesting, because you were at the same time consultant, manager, but also academic. And in the beginning, it looked more that you would become a professor of political science, doing research at the Institute of Advanced Research in Vienna, and then also getting the Habilitation at the University of Vienna in the 1990s. But finally, management was more attractive. And if you look at Roland Deiser's biography, you will see that he holds and held a number of advisory board positions. He was doing all kinds of things, but he was always also an academic, publishing books and papers. And among his publications, I would just cite a few recent ones: Designing the Smart Organization, Ecosystem Leadership, Transformers, and How to Succeed in Business Ecosystems. And this brings us to the topic of this afternoon. We are extremely happy to have you here, Roland. And yeah, we are looking forward to your lecture. Thank you.
It's on, yeah. That was an absolutely fabulous introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's super nice to be here with you guys. It's hot and warm, so just relax. I will try to make some relaxed afternoon here. Yeah, as you said, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about our recent work we did at the Center for the Future of Organization about business ecosystem leadership. And you may want to think, you know, what has this really to do with fractured society, you know, and coming together after the crisis of COVID and things like that. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later also in the discussion, because ecosystem thinking is something which actually is not a new thing, as you will see, but it's something that really has gained prominence a lot in the last few years within business. And most businesses really have no clue really how to deal with that. But we need that kind of thinking in order to also really get into stuff like sustainability and solve issues that go beyond the narrow interest of organizations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, you know, over the next maybe 45 minutes, if I may, something like that. And then let's get into some discussion. So let's start, you know, about the center a little bit on which I'm actually working. It's a center that I created 7 years ago, I think, something like that, at the Drucker School of Management. Peter Drucker, we just talked about that as well, is an Austrian. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's actually really seen as the, let's say, the Pope of management, the guy who really founded a lot of major management theories. He wrote dozens of books and is extremely well respected in the academic community. And it's quite nice to see that, this his work lives on at Claremont Credit University, where he taught about 20 years before he passed away, I think in 2005. We are a think tank, and we look at challenges of 21st century organizations. In a way, the tradition of Peter Drucker, quite interesting as well. We follow 3 principles, right? It's interdisciplinary, which means he sees management as a liberal art, very different than the traditional business school curriculum, right? MBAs, usually it's finance, it's marketing, it's optimization of processes and something like that. He sees all these disciplines, psychology, anthropology, political science, and so on, equally important in order to understand what business is about. He also emphasized very much the social responsibility, or general the responsibility of organizations and companies towards the larger good. Very recently, I don't know if you know, BlackRock, the very largest private equity company with several $1 trillion under management, issued a CEO letter in January 22, where they for the first time said, it's not about shareholders, it's about stakeholders, and the planet is a stakeholder. That is, especially in American thinking, this is very, very new, right? And by the way, living in the US, I have to tell you that it's really a huge difference between, if you talk to CEOs in Europe or to CEOs in the United States, there is really still a very tough Wall Street capitalism type of thinking going on, ruthless, careless about other things. Whereas in Europe, we, at least as far as I know, in Germany, let's say Austria, Switzerland, we have this, what we call ökosoziale Marktwirtschaft, ecology, social responsibility, and markets should be on equal footing. So for us, maybe that's something super new, but in the US, there is, if it comes out of BlackRock, I have to say that was quite a sensation, and it impacted also the whole ESG now compliance and stuff like that. So we combine, as I say here, conceptual depth with practical ability. That's also important, and ethical responsibility. So the research we do, here, for instance, we do publications, case studies, briefings, advisory, dialogue platforms, and research, is always not academic. I'll call it pre-academic. It's something that really needs to help organizations to perform better, to emancipate themselves in order that they know what they're doing and stuff like that. So our approach is action research usually, and not the purely for academic journals research, just having said that. So that's briefly about that. So most recently, we have this project on business ecosystem leadership, which was funded partly by a foundation, which we continue to work with. And they love our work, and so we love them, of course, back as they give us continue to give us some money on this. And it's based really on in-depth interviews primarily, partly the organizing business ecosystem leadership includes also an empirical survey of 220 corporations where we looked how they deal with business ecosystems, and stuff like that. So, but before I go into that, I'd like to step back a little bit, right? When we talk about why are ecosystems generally important and what is actually happening to organizations when they start to engage in ecosystems. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of a brief look at the history of work and organizations to put the whole thing into context, right? So starting out, the history of work is a history of hundreds of thousands of years of having no organization, right? Other than the very small groups of cavemen, so to say, who had very basic tools in order to hunt and get their things together. They were nomadic or not, but they were really, in a way, without any formal organization, of course. And we must not forget, and I find it's really important to look at that, because emotionally, we are still more or less in that kind of level of groups that we can relate to, and we have a very hard time to relate to abstract organizations that are complex and require representation, especially if they become very large with 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 layers of hierarchy. It's alienation kicks in. And emotionally, humans are programmed for working in small groups where they can relate and have relationships, tribes, not bigger than maybe 100 people, 200 people. This is it. Then wheat comes, or let's say you settle down, and you could actually start to create food not only for yourself but for the larger population, which meant you could have a division of labor a little bit. Those who planted the food could feed others, others could start to do different kind of things. So I think that this, of course, was one of the major steps in human evolution, and it then also coincides with the development of culture, right? You had then slaves, you had slaves enabling, a cultural upper class, and that actually created eventually organizations and smaller communities. Very fast forward, we have an artisan age, and we are still not really in complex organizations yet, right? We have an artisan society in the Middle Ages where people have crafts, you have the trades, you have the guilds and things like that. And it's quite interesting to see economy. Who knows what economy means translated into English? It's already English, I'm sorry, but what's the origin of the word? Economy. Yeah, so my old Greek kind of education, right? It's oikos, which is the house, and nomos, which is the law. So economy is the laws of the house, which means for a long, long time, economy happened in the house. And only very recently, maybe a few hundred years ago, it moved out of the house into this, right? And that really is now the birth of the modern organization, which in the early days in the industrial society is just an image of many you could use, is something where you would have alienated work. This work here is not alienated. Marx would say, through work we gain identity. And this is what's happened back then. This takes away identity because it makes you more or less a cog, in a kind of a machine, famously Modern Times and Charlie Chaplin, right? And this is a work environment and the nature of work and organization, which actually really in Taylorism was the prevailing management theory of the 20th century. This needs command and control. This needs, kind of scalability of people. It needs something where the individual is actually a problem because they need to be really equal to come to work, along the same lines and things like that. Now, things are changing. If you look at this, that instead of now you have these armies of people looking here, you have suddenly robots doing that work. So we have automatization. Of course, the big discussion, is this taking away jobs? Are these even great jobs it takes away? That's another question. But we know that automation is changing really the nature of work and the whole kind of thing. And at the same time, we have now, through digital tools, also the ability to get back into an artisan culture back home, right? David, my son, who sits here in the third row, when he was, how old were you when you did your music production first in the garage, 16? Or something like that, right? With a few means of, it was less than $1,000, you could produce music and, really publish even music and things like that, things that were not possible before. Think 3D printing, think all these technologies that enable people to become producers again and artisans again, right? Maker spaces and things like that. So we have actually a hybrid situation in the future of work where we, on one hand, digital enables us to automize really large scales of maybe, routine work. And at the same time, we have digitalization enabling us to go back to an artisan and get more sense in what we're doing. And that might, that's a separate lecture or talk, possibly, what this will mean in the future. But COVID clearly has accelerated these kind of things, working from home, for instance, right? And all these kind of things. So that was a little bit about putting this into context. and we will see why it relates to ecosystems in a second. Let me talk about those changing contexts for a second that organizations have been facing, let's say, in the last 20 years or so. So typically 21st century types of paradigms where we still see that organizations live very much in the 20th century though. So yeah, before I get into this, I want to quote Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who you may know as Lenin, possibly, who said there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. And I kind of really love that quote. And a few recent, events that we had, I mean, COVID, of course, is much, much more than just weeks, but it's something, it changes things that, on a huge scale that haven't been, in the books for a long time. So the point being, what are these key events? And there are other key events as well. Ukraine, just to name a few, right? We had the financial crisis recently. So we have these major change and transitions that are happening, and let's see what it does to organizations. So trends that shape business, a few of them just quickly. So what we see is that we move from value-creating companies to value-creating ecosystems, which means that the unit that creates value is not that much anymore just a single organization. More and more, a single organization must be able to collaborate with others in order to create some joint value proposition for the market. And that's a very different paradigm because you cannot do it independently from others. Drawing the boundary along your own organization, around your own organization is actually, doesn't really work that well. Another one is, it's not about products and services anymore. Those are of course important, but it's about the customer experience. And the customer experience includes much, much more than just a product and service. It's when you call, how are you call a call center, how are you treated? What are the red tape you meet when you do certain kind of things? The product can be great, but there are many, many steps in the customer experience, and all those steps in the customer experience needs to be met. And very often, one organization alone cannot meet that, and they need partners to do that. Crisis robustness was something you could use in organizations when times were stable, relatively stable and predictable. Obviously, as times are not predictable anymore, which is almost a euphemism to say, times are really disruptive and stuff like that. In these disruptive times when change is not only constant, but it's really a disruptive thing where many people just don't know how to deal with that. Organizations need to have something which you may call an agile resilience, because robustness doesn't work, right? You are stuck in a model that doesn't work anymore in a new context. And I actually prefer even the verb or the term anti-fragility. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Anti-fragility is something where you say, well, I'm embracing adversity as an opportunity to innovate and grow. So, adversity like COVID, you can try to defend it with your old business model. You probably will fail. You can try to adapt as much as you can. Okay, better. You can try to embrace it and say, what opportunity does this give to me? And the same is true for really all these crises we see these days. Anti-fragile organizations, embrace them and make something new out of that. A great example, ESG. I know if you're familiar with ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, which are now regulated also by the European Union, to assure that the climate goals are met. These ESG issues are for many companies a threat. Oh my God, now I need to comply with carbon footprint restrictions and stuff like that. How can I do that? Company number one might say, well, I try to still not get caught, right? I just do my old thing and not get caught. Others say, well, I try to comply, but they stay within their old business model and just try to do whatever it takes to get there. Or others can say, well, I use this as a new way to branch out into new business areas and innovate, and I embrace it, and that would be anti-fragile. We move from opaque and closed systems to open systems and transparent systems, which is an important element as well, which, by the way, when it comes to data sharing and things like that, which we'll see then in a minute, is quite a challenge in the traditional German culture of data protection, but we will move towards transparency and openness. And from deciding and implementing as a management kind of style towards an invitation to participate. Now, what I want to say is it moves towards does not mean the old stuff is not valid anymore, is not valuable anymore. It's more a plus almost, yeah, that I would like to put there, because you still, need products and services, plus you need to design that. Yeah, you still need companies, plus you need ecosystems. So it's not an either or, just to say here. And the same holds true for the paradigms that I'm going through here as well, real quick. For instance, strategy is not something you can plan for the long range anymore, right? It's kind of, well, if tomorrow another thing happens, all my plans are done. We know that if strategic planning departments try to put together in that usual annual cycle, stuff, that the moment the plans are done, they're outdated. We also know that many consultancies that live off that, right? A BCG or McKinsey or whatever, that puts on huge PowerPoint decks. This is your strategy, and now they try to shove it down in cascading things to the organization. That is not something that works. So the whole notion of strategy is how do you create in an organization a just-in-time responsiveness? How can organizations become something where say things are changing? Immediately, we can even co-create that change, or at least be anti-fragile and embrace that change. Customers are not anymore targets, but customers become very important stakeholders in co-creating whatever you want to do with them. You cannot be customer-centric without embracing and co-creating things with them. You do not treat customers as a transactional kind of target. You treat them as a partner. And the same thing, by the way, goes to suppliers, of course, and other stakeholders as well. Long-lasting organizations, there are still organizations out there who will last long, but I think the paradigm that is emerging is that we have these short-lived and lightweight organizations. We have seen this already in project organization that happens within large companies, but we see this also in the emergence of micro-organizations that emerge for a short time, then fall apart again and stuff like that. I always like in this context, and I might come back to that a couple of times, Hollywood as a model of organization, right? Where you make a movie, you bring together people for a short-lived organization. It lasts maybe a year. If you take on the distribution and everything and recovering, it lasts maybe 10 years, but that's not really an organization anymore. The real making of the movie are shifting constellations of stakeholders. First, the producer that puts together the deals, then the physical thing that gets done, and then maybe the marketing and exploitation. But those are different types of organizations that come together for a certain purpose, for a certain period of time only, and then fall apart again. To come together for a new project with possibly different players, different people, but still with the same principle. So the long-lasting organization like a GE, a Siemens, a Daimler, they are threatened species, and they will have to work hard to do really both and establish within their own boundaries or in an ecosystem these lightweight and short-lived organizations. Then, which consequently, of course, intra-organizational design, you design an organization with its processes and its structures and responsibilities and whatever you need in an organization, right? You would define this is just for us because that's our organization. No, the future means inter-organizational design. You have to design for stakeholders you do not own, you do not control. And that's, by the way, a very interesting discussion to look at when we look at the European Union, and all these kind of issues of federalism versus central governance, because that's also something where you need to take into account, an inter-organizational design without having the power really to do so. And we've discussed this this morning real quick, right? What can you really do in the large-scale system, but that needs to be done in ecosystems. And two more, we move from owning your own resources to being resourceful, which means why would you own too much? Because owning stuff is just a baggage, right? If you own a lot of things, you know, it just tears you down. You have a manufacturing plant, you have buildings, you have all kinds of, so that is really tearing you down. Whereas if you're resourceful, you know where to go to get really on short-term things that you may need and then get rid of them again. And there is a development, obviously, you know, if you look at some business models of platforms, you know, Uber famously doesn't own the car fleets, or Airbnb famously does not own the places they, you know, rent out in these platform businesses. But it's also true in many collaborations in ecosystems where, you know, this party and this stakeholder knows these things better, so I don't have to do them. And so there's a big and important element in that. And finally, you know, when it comes to leadership, leadership as command and control gives a little bit way to leadership that is enabling self-organization. That's just a different paradigm of leadership. However, again, you know, enabling only without having some idea how to also command and control also doesn't work. So we need to have a really dialectical balance between these kind of things, because somebody also needs to make sure that enabling leadership culture gets implemented. And for that, you need decision power. So coming to these kind of things. So now we talk quickly about the emergence of business ecosystems, right? Which was merely the title of my thing. And this is what we were doing research in the last couple of years, as I mentioned. And the image I put up here is really that the big enabler of business ecosystems is the digital technology. Digital transformation, by the way, we did a project, I think in 2018, on digital transformation challenges in large and complex organizations. And one of the key results was that the ecosystem topic is an important one. It came out of that. So eventually that research on digital transformation led us to the ecosystem research. And if you look at a few of these images, like there's a cloud, right? And other technologies, data sharing that the cloud enables, blockchain, which enables new ways to contracting across horizontal boundaries, or artificial intelligence, and all kinds of social technologies are digital technologies that change really fundamentally the rules of the game. We always have lived in a way, of course, in ecosystems. There were customers, suppliers, and so on, but usually it was a transactional relationship. Traditionally, it was something, you know, Michael Porter had that value chain, right? There's a supplier, then there's a production, and the outcomes, something that goes to the customer. Now, suddenly, with digital technology, we can share data and do something together that was before not possible. And I'll relate to that a little bit later in more detail, but yeah, maybe one example. Airbus created a few years ago a company together with others called Skywise. And Skywise is a predictive maintenance company for airplane engines, where, you know, they say, well, if we would get out of all the engines that run on airplanes, more or less data, and we have machine learning, you know, that helps with these data, then we can predict when some failure will happen. So they did this to improve maintenance and be faster, you know, before anything happens, they already can repair it, stuff like that. Now, if you want to do something like that, you need actually, what do you need? You need access to the data from all the engines, right? So where are the engines? They sit at customers' planes, right? So they needed to work with customers to get access to the data from their planes. So they chose one key customer, it was Delta Airlines, coincidentally, and eventually, together with Delta and some software companies and machine learning and AI experts and predictive maintenance experts, they formed this Skywise kind of thing. And a key thing was sharing data. And one thing was, you know, engines, I don't know if you know the industry, but you know, there is Pratt Whitney, there's Rolls-Royce, there are various engine companies, and they sit not only on Airbus planes, they sit on Boeing planes as well, right? So suddenly you see, if you want to have a business model that goes across, you know, customers, competitors, and everything, and needs software partners, and needs, you know, other elements, it is something where only through digital technologies you can actually even have such a model and think about these kind of things. And it comes with all kinds of issues that actually have to do with business ecosystem leadership competencies. So what is a business ecosystem even, right? Because when we talk to the executives in these large organizations, we heard all kinds of, you know, answers, and the definition is not clear. Platforms, many say that's the ecosystem. Others say, well, you know, it's the planet, and it's kind of biological ecosystems. We define our own definition here, a very simple one, just a value creation network, right, of an organization that reaches beyond its boundaries. So it's more or less the extended enterprise, but the extended enterprise, yeah, that includes customers, competitors, regulators, what have you, right, as a network rather than a transactional linear kind of thing. So everybody who plays a role in the overall creation of value of a company. And leadership is the ability to actively shape such a system, right? And that is not trivial, right? Because the problem is you are just one organization, and within your organization you may be able to shape something because you have governance rights. You do not have these governance rights outside your organization. So how do you shape something which you don't have really the power to do? And that is the big challenge of business ecosystem leadership, leading without having power. You need something like soft power. You need all kinds of issues that are not in the command and control domain. So let's talk about a few issues if you really want to enable business ecosystem leadership. So for that I drink some coffee to get some energy back. One of the most important ones, I guess, is mindset. And famously, I think it was Otto Scharmer from MIT who said, you know, who said this ego versus ecosystems. We tend to think all the time in ego rather than eco. And we have, as individuals, this tendency to think about ourselves more than about others. We have as organizations this, we have as mankind even this. The reason I put up this world map is because it symbolizes the geocentric kind of paradigm, right? When we think, you know, the Earth is the center of the universe, the sun circles the Earth, and the rest of the universe circles the Earth, and we are the middle of the universe. And Copernicus then, and you know, it took quite a resistance to overcome certain resistance in order to finally find out that, you know, we're part of a solar system, and the Earth is just one of many planets that circuits the sun, and eventually, oh my God, the sun system, solar system is not the center of the galaxy. It's somewhere at the fringes of the Milky Way. And by the way, the Milky Way is not the center of the universe. It's one of many galaxies. And hey, by the way, this universe is maybe not the only universe. So at the end of the day, understanding and distancing yourself totally from, you know, your ego, from putting yourself on all kinds of levels into the center is a key mindset challenge. And in most organizations, you find very much this ecosystem attitude. And it's also actually exacerbated by, for instance, the shareholder value principle, right? If the investors are interested in the return they get from their company only, why would the company look at other things, right? So they are focused really on creating their own value only without regard to other kind of elements. And so that's one element that contributes to that. Also, the larger an organizations get, the more they're inward oriented. You know, they are busy with themselves, with huge bureaucracies and with all kinds of in-house meetings to coordinate and things like that. That leads to actually a kind of a ego orientation as well. Startups, for instance, have a much easier time to reach out and think in ecosystems. Governance, another issue to consider. The interesting thing, as I mentioned before a little bit, is that if you have an organization, you have more or less, a kind of constitution which is given to you for free. If you found a company, there are laws out there. There's a labor law. If you hire people, you can hire them. There's all kinds of structures there you can actually rely on. There is a board of directors, a CEO is described what his responsibility is, and so on and so forth. In an ecosystem, the governance is not clear at all. You have customers, you have suppliers, you have regulators, you have all kinds of stakeholders who need to collaborate somehow in order to create the value, but nobody can tell them how they're governed, right? There is no law, really. So they have to constitute their own law, and which are, by the way, quite difficult processes. For instance, case studies like Skywise came to fruition at Airbus or other ecosystems are interesting cases to see how emerges a kind of rules of collaboration, rules of the game that had to be, negotiated. It's almost you create something like the European Union from scratch all the time, right? How do you create that constitution? So that's a very big issue. We see also that there is a structural conflict between the inside governance of an organization. So let's say the corporate governance can command and control. In the ecosystem, you cannot command and control, other than you would agree to a boss in the ecosystem, but that's usually not the case. Boundary management, a very important element. I call it differentiated permeability. I hope this is not too much Latin. It is really taken from the permeability of synapses, right? I took this picture at the Biennale. It was, I think, the Persian, right? We said the Persian exhibit. But I liked the image showing various sized holes, right? And then outside, there are various sized planets or elements or whatever they are. And if you look at an organization, they almost in a way have towards their partners probably different levels of openness, right? So let's say here in the middle, is this a pointer here? I'm not sure. Maybe, yeah, there's a pointer. So this one here in the middle, for instance, let's say, I can really open up large for certain reasons, because this is a close partner. I can share a lot with this partner, and we almost would merge almost as close, right? But then you have ones that are very tiny, right, where you cannot here, right? You close them up. Some stuff is even closed where you don't let anybody through. In an ecosystem, if you have various partners, it's not easy to say which IP do I share, right? Let's say a pharmaceutical company who invested billions in the development of a new drug. What of this IP do I really share in an ecosystem, and what do I close down, right? And that's hard, actually, business and political decisions. But we know the more is shared, the more fluid the ecosystem can work, right? If people don't share, the whole idea of the ecosystem doesn't work. So this differentiated permeability is a big capability. Yeah, the transcending of boundaries is important. I call this institutionalized curiosity. If you're not curious what the others do, if you don't care what's going on outside, care what's going on in the customer, care what's going on in partners you're working with, then you won't be able really to work with them close. And the curiosity is really, I'd say institutional curiosity is a great tool to transcend boundaries. And when I mean boundaries of industry, right? If you're only in banking, but I need to understand maybe also, I don't know, the digital industries, or I need to maybe understand the chemical industries if I want to create certain kind of new value propositions and get out of my industry boundaries. The same goes, of course, for functional boundaries in organizations, right? IT only talks to IT. HR only talks to HR. You know, they have their own language, their own systems. How can you be curious what's going on in the other system is an important element. Cross-boundary collaboration, you know, once I've got those boundaries transcended, I need to collaborate across these boundaries. And this is really what makes ecosystems work, right? Getting back to the film kind of, and Hollywood, you know, kind of metaphor, filmmaking is all about appreciating the talents of the people you surround yourself with. Because you know you could never have made any of these movies by yourself, which is a quote by Steven Spielberg. And, you know, the biggest visionary director cannot make a movie without actors, without screenwriters, without people who put on, I don't know, they're experts in their field, right? They put on, I don't know, makeup or set design and special effects and what have you. And all these kind of talents need to come together. And that is something that needs this cross-boundary collaboration. But each of those traits, and actually Hollywood still has guilds, interestingly, right? Almost in this old kind of style that we mentioned before in the artisan world. They have deep expertise in what they do. But in order to make a movie, they need to let go also of their expertise and embrace a vision which is larger than just their own vision. So I think it's really a great parallel here, what we see in Hollywood. Yeah, interorganizational connectivity, I'm almost at the end. Interorganizational connectivity, which means that in ecosystems works, you need a technical infrastructure, clearly, right? You need a shared IT system, you know, you need some kind of agreement on data sharing and all the processes and cybersecurity elements and stuff that go in there. But you need also social infrastructure. You need to have people that, you know, come together maybe in platforms where they discuss. You need new roles that network, that broker networks and things like that. So the social infrastructure and the technical infrastructure of connectivity. And finally, you know, in an ecosystem, you have a high degree of diversity. Think about an ecosystem where you have startups, you have license holders, you have a research lab at a university, you might have a manufacturing operation, you might have, you know, some distribution company attached and so on and so forth. And together they form the ecosystem that provides the value. Now, the culture, the operating system and everything will be very different from each of those partners, right? The startup is fast and agile. You know, the manufacturing company is maybe runs after very different operating, you know, goes only of efficiency and scale. You know, the regulator, again, runs under different kind of premises and so on and so forth. So you have to deal with these multiple operating systems, multiple business models, and also what I call the multiple deal types. Because with some in an ecosystem, you might have a very close partnership, almost a joint venture. With another one, you have a loose licensing deal. With a third one, you might have a strategic partnership. You know, each contract may be different. And again, Hollywood, if you step into the room of a lawyer who puts together a deal for a movie, you might have tons of contracts, each contract being different. Even between various actors, every actor negotiates his own contract. Every partner in that movie production negotiates its own contract. So you've got a contractual architecture that is a substitute really for the structured governance you find in traditional organizations. So I end with saying that today most management systems unfortunately stay within the boundaries of the organization. I made this image where, you know, they're surrounded by bubbles and they're within a bubble, right? Which really is a barrier to ecosystem engagement, right? It's driven by a mindset of ownership and control. I want to own everything. I want to control everything. It's driven by, you know, there are no instruments and metrics that deal with the outside. Everything we have in organizations to measure is the performance of the own organization usually. And it's exacerbated by a general tendency to inwards orientation, especially in large companies. We have created this framework to tackle these issues. I don't want to go into detail here, but it has 3 dimensions, as you can see: strategy, organization, and relationships. The relationship being maybe the most important one here. And it includes some of, I call this decentration competence, for instance, is ego versus eco, right? And so on and so forth. And we're currently working on, how should I say, an index that measures the abilities of companies to follow these capabilities and identify capability gaps so they can address them step by step. So my final slide says, if you are striving for business ecosystem leadership, then you embark on a transformation nolens volens. You cannot help. Because if you really want to do that, you have to go across boundaries. You've got to be open. You've got to start to share. You've got to start to care. You've got to do all these kind of things which goes beyond the traditional model how organizations worked in the past. So if you really want to be a leader in an ecosystem, you automatically transform yourself to the organization of the 21st century, which is a much more networked organization, a horizontally networked organization than it was before. So, this image here, it's a little cheesy maybe, at the end, a butterfly, but I thought it's kind of, you have this kind of tight little knot here at the beginning, and through understanding what's going on in your ecosystem, you fly in a different way. So, last thing, we have a global dialogue platform on these issues. We also continuously publish stuff. There is a blog on LinkedIn and stuff like that. So if you go on the website, futureorg.org, or you follow us on LinkedIn, invited, then you can stay up to speed on what we are doing here. So that was that. Thank you.